What if nothing in your life has ever actually stayed the same? Not your thoughts, not your identity, not even the things you believe define you. It only feels that way because the change is too slow to notice. Over 2,000 years ago, Heraclitus built his entire philosophy on this idea that everything is constantly changing, and most people are completely blind to it. And once you start to see it, you can't unsee it. Heraclitus was born around 535 BCE in the city of Ephesus, into a world that was still in the early stages of philosophical thinking. Unlike later philosophers who would build large systems with clear structures, his world was one where ideas were still raw, forming, and often expressed in fragments rather than complete explanations. And in many ways, he remained true to that early style, leaving behind not a polished system, but a series of powerful, difficult statements that continue to provoke thought even now. From the very beginning, he stood apart, not just in what he thought, but in how he approached thinking itself. He did not write in long, clear arguments meant to guide the reader step by step. Instead, he wrote in short, dense observations, almost like riddles, forcing anyone who reads them to slow down and confront the meaning directly. This was not accidental. It reflects something deeper about his philosophy. He did not believe that truth could be easily handed over. It had to be encountered, struggled with, and understood through effort. He was often described as distant, even critical of those around him. While other thinkers gathered students and built schools, he remained more isolated, expressing a kind of frustration with how most people live and think. In his view, the majority move through life without truly understanding the structure of reality. They follow habits, accept appearances, and rarely question what lies beneath. At the center of his philosophy lies one of the most famous and unsettling ideas ever expressed, that everything is in constant change. For him, stability is an illusion. What appears fixed is only a moment within an ongoing process. He captures this idea through a simple but powerful image. A person cannot step into the same river twice. The water is always moving, always changing, and so the river is never truly the same from one moment to the next. But this idea goes further than it first appears. It is not only the river that changes. The person stepping into it changes as well. Experience, time, and perception shift continuously. Nothing remains exactly as it was, not the world, not the observer, not even the act of observation itself. This creates a view of reality that is fundamentally unstable, or at least constantly shifting. There is no fixed foundation in the ordinary sense. Everything is part of a process of becoming rather than simply being. At first, this might seem like it leads to chaos, but his philosophy does not stop there. Alongside change, he introduces another concept, something that holds this constant movement together. He calls it the logos. The logos, in his thought, represents an underlying order or structure within the constant flow of change. It is not something visible in the way objects are visible, but it is what gives coherence to the movement. Without it, change would be random. With it, change follows a pattern, even if that pattern is not immediately obvious. What makes this idea difficult is that most people, in his view, fail to recognize this underlying order. They see the surface of things, but not the structure beneath. They experience change, but do not understand how it fits into a larger pattern. This creates a gap between reality and perception. The world operates according to a certain structure, but human understanding often remains limited, focused on appearances rather than deeper connections. He also introduced the idea that conflict is not something to be avoided, but something fundamental to existence. Opposites are not separate forces that disrupt order. They are part of the same system. Day and night, life and death, growth and decay. These are not isolated events. They define each other. One cannot exist without the other. Without tension between opposites, there would be no movement, no change, no structure. This idea challenges the common assumption that harmony means the absence of conflict. In his view, harmony is created through conflict. It is the balance of opposing forces, not their elimination, that produces order. This perspective reshapes how reality is understood. Instead of seeing the world as something that should remain stable and consistent, it becomes something dynamic, where change and tension are essential, not accidental. At the same time, his philosophy carries a strong critique of ordinary thinking. He believed that most people live as if they have their own private understanding, disconnected from the deeper structure of reality. They rely on personal opinion, habit, and immediate perception, rather than seeking the underlying order that connects everything. For him, wisdom is not about accumulating information. It is about recognizing this deeper structure, aligning thought with the logos, and seeing beyond the surface level of things. By the time his early ideas had taken shape, he had already introduced a way of thinking that feels both simple and deeply unsettling. A world where nothing stands still, where conflict is necessary, and where order exists, but is often hidden from those who do not look carefully. And in doing so, he left behind a philosophy that does not offer comfort through stability, but demands attention to a reality that is constantly shifting, yet somehow still held together by a structure that remains just out of reach for most people. As his thought continues to unfold, what becomes increasingly clear is that his philosophy is not only about change, but about how human beings fail to understand change. It is one thing to say that everything is in motion. It is another to recognize what that actually means for the way people live, think, and interpret the world around them. Most people, in his view, live as if stability is the default condition. They expect things to remain consistent, predictable, and aligned with their expectations. When change occurs, it feels like a disruption, something unusual or even wrong. But for him, this perspective is reversed. Change is not the exception. It is the rule. Stability, as people imagine it, is only a temporary appearance within a continuous process. This misunderstanding creates a kind of constant tension in human life. People hold on to what is already shifting. They resist what is already unfolding. They try to preserve what cannot remain the same. And in doing so, they create a sense of conflict that does not come from the world itself, but from their refusal to see it clearly. He pushes this idea further by examining how perception itself is shaped by this misunderstanding. What people call reality is often just a snapshot, a moment taken out of a larger flow. They see something at a single point in time and treat it as fixed, ignoring the process that produced it and the changes that will continue after it. This creates a fragmented way of seeing. Instead of understanding reality as movement, it is experienced as a series of disconnected states. This makes it difficult to grasp the deeper structure that connects those states into a continuous whole. At the same time, his idea of the logos becomes more central and more complex. It is not simply an abstract principle that explains order. It becomes the key to understanding how change itself can be coherent. Without the logos, constant change would lead to unpredictability and chaos. But with it, change follows patterns, even if those patterns are not immediately visible. There is a structure to becoming, a rhythm to transformation that holds everything together. What makes this difficult is that the logos is not something that can be easily observed. It is not an object that can be pointed to. It must be understood through reflection, through the ability to see connections rather than isolated events. He believed that most people fail at this not because they lack intelligence, but because they do not look deeply enough. They remain at the surface, reacting to appearances rather than seeking the underlying order. This leads to one of his more critical observations about human behavior. People often trust their senses without question, assuming that what they see is all that exists. But in his view, the senses provide only a partial and sometimes misleading picture. They show what is immediate, but not what is fundamental. Understanding requires going beyond what is immediately visible. It requires recognizing patterns, relationships, and tensions that are not obvious at first glance. He also expands on his idea of opposites, showing that they are not simply contrasting states, but part of a continuous process. Something does not just move from one state to another in a simple, linear way. The two states are connected, interdependent, and often exist within each other. For example, what is considered growth contains the possibility of decline. What is considered strength contains the potential for weakness. These are not separate categories. They are different expressions of the same underlying process. This creates a more fluid understanding of reality, where boundaries between concepts become less rigid. Instead of fixed categories, there are transitions, shifts, and overlapping states. This perspective can feel unsettling because it removes the certainty that comes from clear divisions. But it also provides a deeper sense of coherence. It shows that what appears contradictory on the surface may be part of a larger unity. At the same time, he introduces the idea that tension itself is necessary for structure. Without opposing forces, there would be no movement, no change, and ultimately no form. He uses the analogy of something like a bow or a lyre, where tension between opposing ends creates the possibility of function. This means that conflict is not something that disrupts order. It is something that produces it. The balance between opposing forces is what allows the system to exist at all. This idea challenges the common desire for a world without conflict, without difficulty, without opposition. In his view, such a world would not be stable. It would not even be real in any meaningful sense, because it would lack the dynamic tension that gives structure to existence. He also becomes more focused on the gap between individual understanding and the shared structure of reality. While the logos is common, meaning it exists as a universal order, people live as if they each have their own private reality. They interpret events according to personal perspective, often ignoring the larger pattern that connects everything. This creates a kind of isolation, not physical, but intellectual. People are surrounded by the same reality, yet they experience it differently because they fail to align their thinking with the underlying structure. Wisdom, in his view, is the ability to bridge this gap. It is the movement from personal opinion to a more universal understanding. It requires stepping beyond immediate impressions and recognizing the deeper order that shapes everything. By this stage, his philosophy becomes both more demanding and more precise. It does not offer simple explanations or easy comfort. It requires a shift in how reality is perceived, from something stable and fixed to something dynamic and interconnected. And within that shift lies a deeper challenge. To see not just what is happening, but how it is happening. Not just the surface of change, but the structure that makes change possible. Because once that structure begins to come into view, even partially, the world no longer appears as a collection of separate events, but as a continuous process where everything is connected through movement, tension, and an order that remains present, even when it is not immediately understood. As his thought continues to deepen, what begins to emerge is not just a philosophy about change, but a completely different way of experiencing reality itself. By this stage, he is no longer simply describing how things move or how opposites interact. He is pointing towards something more difficult to grasp, that what people call stability, identity, and even truth are far less fixed than they appear. One of the most challenging implications of his thinking lies in how he treats identity over time. If everything is constantly changing, then what does it mean for something to remain the same? A river changes from moment to moment, but it is still called a river. A person changes continuously, physically, mentally, emotionally, yet is still considered the same individual. This creates a tension between language and reality. Language tends to fix things, to give them stable names and identities. But reality, in his view, does not fully cooperate with this. What is named as one thing is, in fact, a continuous process. This does not mean that identity is meaningless, but it does mean that it is more fluid than it appears. What we call something is often a convenient way of referring to a pattern within change, not a fixed entity that remains unchanged over time. This insight begins to affect how knowledge itself is understood. If reality is constantly shifting, then knowledge cannot simply be a collection of fixed facts. It must involve an awareness of processes, of how things transform, how they move from one state to another. At the same time, he becomes more focused on the idea that understanding requires a kind of attention that most people do not practice. It is not enough to observe what is immediately visible. One must learn to notice patterns across time, to see how things develop, how they reverse, how they depend on opposing forces. This kind of attention is difficult because it goes against habitual thinking. People prefer clear definitions, stable categories, and predictable outcomes. These provide a sense of certainty. But his philosophy removes much of that certainty, replacing it with a more dynamic and less comfortable view. He also continues to refine his idea of unity within opposition. By this stage, it becomes clear that opposites are not simply connected, but inseparable. They do not just interact. They define each other in such a way that one cannot exist without the other. For example, the idea of health only makes sense in relation to illness. Strength is understood through weakness. Order is recognized against the possibility of disorder. These are not separate conditions that happen to exist together. They are part of the same structure. This leads to a deeper realization. What people often try to eliminate, difficulty, conflict, instability, may actually be necessary for the very concepts they value. Without contrast, there is no clarity. Without tension, there is no structure. This challenges the instinct to seek a world that is entirely comfortable or entirely stable. In his view, such a world would not function. It would lose the very dynamics that make it meaningful. At the same time, he introduces a more subtle idea about hidden order. While the logos provide structure to change, that structure is not always visible on the surface. In fact, it is often concealed within complexity. He suggests that what appears chaotic or random may actually follow patterns that are not immediately recognized. This means that understanding requires patience, the willingness to look beyond first impressions and to remain open to patterns that reveal themselves over time. This idea adds another layer to his critique of ordinary thinking. People often judge quickly, forming conclusions based on limited information. They assume that what they see is complete, that what they experience is fully understood. But in his view, this confidence is misplaced. Reality is deeper than it appears, and understanding requires a kind of humility, an acknowledgement that what is immediately visible may not be the full picture. He also becomes more direct in his criticism of how people relate to truth. Many, in his view, prefer agreement over understanding. They accept commonly held beliefs without examining them, repeating ideas that feel familiar rather than questioning whether they align with the deeper structure of reality. This creates a kind of collective blindness. People share the same world, but fail to recognize its underlying order because they rely on surface-level thinking. Wisdom, for him, is not simply knowing more. It is seeing differently. It is the ability to recognize patterns where others see randomness, to accept change where others seek stability, and to understand unity where others perceive conflict. By this stage, his philosophy has moved far beyond simple observations about nature. It has become a framework for rethinking how reality itself is approached. It challenges not only specific beliefs, but the habits of thought that produce those beliefs. It does not offer a stable ground in the usual sense. Instead, it offers something more difficult, the ability to remain grounded within movement, to find coherence within change, and to recognize that what appears contradictory on the surface may be part of a deeper and more unified structure. And within that realization lies a shift that is not easy to reverse. Because once it becomes clear that everything is in flux, that identity is fluid, that opposites are connected, and that order is often hidden, the world no longer appears as a fixed set of things. It begins to appear as a continuous process, one where understanding is not about holding on to certainty, but about learning to see the patterns within constant transformation, even when those patterns are not immediately visible. As his life moved toward its final years, what becomes most striking is not how much he explained, but but how much he left unresolved on the surface, as if he understood that the nature of reality he was pointing toward could never be fully captured in fixed statements. His philosophy does not close itself neatly. It remains open, almost deliberately incomplete, reflecting the very principle he argued for, that everything is in motion, and any attempt to fully fix it in a final form will miss something essential. By this stage, his thinking is no longer just about observing change or recognizing the unity of opposites. It becomes something deeper, a demand to live with an awareness that stability, certainty, and permanence are far more limited than they appear, and that most of what people rely on for a sense of security is built on something that is already shifting. He understood that human beings have a strong tendency to search for something fixed, something that can be held onto without question. Whether it is identity, belief, structure, or expectation, there's a constant attempt to create a sense of permanence in a reality that does not fully allow it. This creates a quiet but persistent tension. People move through a world that is constantly changing, while at the same time trying to treat parts of it as if they are not. They form attachments, build expectations, and create narratives that assume continuity, even when the underlying reality does not guarantee it. For him, this is not simply an error in thinking. It is one of the central reasons why understanding remains limited. As long as a person insists on seeing stability where there is only temporary form, they will continue to misinterpret the nature of what they experience. This does not mean that nothing has structure. His philosophy never collapses into pure chaos. The logos remains central, the idea that there's an underlying order that holds everything together, even as everything changes. But that order is not the same as permanence. It does not freeze reality into fixed states. It organizes movement. This distinction becomes crucial. Order does not mean stillness. It means coherence within change. Once this is understood, the way reality is experienced begins to shift. Instead of searching for fixed points, attention moves toward patterns, toward relationships, toward how things transform rather than what they are at a single moment. This shift is not easy because it removes a certain kind of comfort. Fixed identities, stable expectations, clear boundaries, these provide a sense of control. When those begin to dissolve, even partially, it can feel disorienting. But he does not present this as something to avoid. He presents it as something to understand, because the discomfort does not come from reality itself, but from the mismatch between reality and the way it is being interpreted. He also deepens his reflection on conflict, bringing it to a more fundamental level. Conflict is not only present in external situations or in visible opposites like day and night. It exists within processes, within transitions, within the very structure of becoming. Every movement involves tension. Every change involves a shift between opposing states. Without this tension, nothing would move, nothing would develop, nothing would exist in any meaningful sense. This leads to a more radical conclusion. What people often experience as instability or disorder may actually be the necessary condition for structure to exist at all. The world does not function despite tension. It functions through it. This perspective challenges the instinct to remove conflict entirely, to seek a reality that is smooth, predictable, and without resistance. In his view, such a reality would not only be impossible, it would also lack the very dynamics that make it real. At the same time, he becomes more focused on the limits of human understanding. While the Logos provides an underlying order, it is not fully accessible in a complete or final way. People can move toward understanding, they can recognize patterns, they can align their thinking more closely with reality, but there will always remain aspects that are not fully grasped. This introduces a kind of intellectual humility into his philosophy. It is not a system that claims total knowledge. It is one that emphasizes the process of understanding, the effort to see more clearly, even if complete clarity is never fully reached. He also reinforces the idea that most people do not engage in this process. They remain at the level of appearances, relying on immediate perception and shared assumptions. This creates a gap between the world as it is structured and the world as it is commonly experienced. And this gap is not small. It shapes how people think, how they act, and how they interpret everything that happens to them. By this stage, his philosophy feels less like a set of teachings and more like a lens, something that changes how everything is seen once it is applied. It does not provide comfort in the traditional sense. It does not promise stability, certainty, or control. Instead, it offers something more demanding: the ability to remain aware within change, to recognize that what appears fixed is temporary, to understand that opposites are not enemies, but parts of a single structure, and to see that beneath constant movement, there is still an order, even if it is not immediately visible. He died around 475 BCE, leaving behind no complete system, no organized school in the way later philosophers would establish. What remained were fragments, statements, ideas that require interpretation, reflection, and effort. But perhaps that is fitting, because a complete, fixed system would stand in contradiction to the very principle he defended. In the end, what he leaves behind is not certainty, but a challenge. A way of seeing that does not settle easily, that does not allow the mind to rest in simple conclusions. A world where everything flows, where identity shifts, where conflict creates structure, and where understanding is not something that is finally achieved, but something that must be continuously pursued. And once that perspective takes hold, even slightly, something begins to change. The desire for absolute stability weakens. The need for fixed answers becomes less urgent. And in its place, there's a different kind of awareness, one that does not depend on things remaining the same, but on the ability to see clearly as they continue to change. Heraclitus begins his philosophy from a position that feels almost unsettling, because instead of looking for stability in the world, he looks directly at change and accepts it as the most fundamental feature of reality. Where others search for permanence, he observes movement. Where others try to define fixed structures, he sees transformation. This is not a small shift in perspective. It overturns the way reality is usually understood. From the very beginning, he presents a simple but profound insight. Everything is in flux. Nothing remains exactly as it is. What appears stable is only a temporary balance within a continuous process of change. A river seems like a single, lasting thing, but the water within it is always moving. Step into it once, and by the time you step again, it is no longer the same river because the flow has already carried it forward. This observation is not limited to physical objects. It applies to everything. Life changes, thoughts change, circumstances change, even identity shifts over time. What a person is at one moment is not identical to what they are at another. There is continuity, but it is a continuity of movement rather than stillness. At first, this might seem to lead to instability or chaos, but Heraclitus does not see it that way. He does not believe that change is random. Instead, he introduces the idea that beneath this constant flux, there is an underlying order, a principle that governs how change occurs. This principle is often described as the logos. The logos is not something visible or separate from the world. It is the structure within change itself, the pattern that makes transformation intelligible rather than chaotic. It is what allows opposites to exist in relation to one another, what gives direction to movement, and what creates coherence within constant variation. Most people, according to Heraclitus, live without recognizing this deeper order. They see change, but they do not understand it. They react to what happens, but they do not perceive the structure that connects events. As a result, their experience of the world feels fragmented and confusing. To live with understanding is to recognize the logos within the flux. It is to see that change is not something to be resisted, but something to be understood. Once this is recognized, the world no longer appears as a series of disconnected events, but as a continuous unfolding guided by an underlying pattern. One of the most striking aspects of this view is the role of opposites. For Heraclitus, Opposites are not simply contradictions that cancel each other out. They are essential to the structure of reality. Without opposition, there would be no movement, no differentiation, no life. Day and night, for example, are not separate in an absolute sense. They define each other. One gives meaning to the other. The same is true for many pairs of opposites, such as tension and release, life and death, growth and decay. These are not independent states, but parts of a continuous process where each transforms into the other. This idea leads to a deeper understanding of unity. Unity is not the absence of difference, but the balance of opposing forces within a single system. Just as a string must be held in tension to produce sound, the world maintains its structure through the interaction of opposing elements. This interaction is not peaceful in a simple sense. Heraclitus often describes it in terms of conflict, but this conflict is not purely destructive. It is productive. It is what drives change and creates new forms. Without it, everything would collapse into a static and lifeless state. From this perspective, what appears as struggle or instability is actually part of a larger order. The tension between opposites is what allows the world to exist as something dynamic and alive. Removing that tension would not create harmony, but would eliminate the conditions that make harmony possible. Heraclitus also challenges the way people think about permanence. When something appears stable, it is often because the changes within it are balanced in a way that creates the impression of consistency. But this balance is temporary. Over time, the underlying changes continue, eventually leading to transformation. This applies not only to physical objects, but to systems, relationships, and even beliefs. What seems fixed is always in the process of becoming something else. Understanding this removes the expectation that things will remain the same and replaces it with an awareness of continuous development. At the same time, this does not lead to a sense of meaninglessness. If everything changes, it does not mean that nothing matters. Instead, it means that meaning must be understood within the process of change itself. Stability is not found by stopping change, but by understanding the pattern within it. This is where the role of human awareness becomes important. While most people move through life reacting to change without understanding it, there is the possibility of a deeper form of perception. A person can learn to observe the patterns within change, to recognize the relationships between opposites, and to see the continuity within transformation. This kind of awareness creates a different relationship with the world. Instead of resisting change or being overwhelmed by it, the individual begins to move with it. They recognize that change is not an obstacle, but the very condition of existence. At the same time, this awareness is not easily achieved. Heraclitus often emphasizes that the logos is common to all, yet most people live as if they have their own separate understanding. They interpret events based on immediate impressions, without recognizing the deeper structure that connects them. To move beyond this requires attention and reflection. It involves looking beyond surface appearances and considering how things relate to one another within the larger process. It is not about collecting information, but about seeing patterns. As this perspective develops, the world begins to appear less fragmented. Events that once seemed isolated are seen as part of a continuous flow. Opposites that once seemed in conflict are understood as interconnected. Change that once seemed chaotic becomes intelligible. This does not remove difficulty or uncertainty. Change can still be challenging, and the future is never fully predictable. But it creates a different way of relating to these conditions. Instead of seeking complete control or permanence, the individual learns to navigate within the flow. In this way, Heraclitus presents a vision of reality that is both dynamic and ordered, where nothing remains the same, yet everything follows a pattern, where conflict is not the opposite of harmony, but part of it, and where understanding comes not from resisting change, but from recognizing the structure that exists within it. As this vision of constant change becomes more familiar, the attention begins to move from observing change itself to understanding how it is experienced by the human mind. Because for Heraclitus, the difficulty is not that reality is in flux, but that people expect it not to be. They look for permanence where there is none, and when things inevitably shift, they experience confusion, resistance, or even distress. The problem is not the nature of the world, but the mismatch between expectation and reality. Most people, in his view, live as though stability is the natural state of things. They build their sense of certainty around what appears consistent in the moment, assuming that it will remain that way. But this assumption is always temporary. When change occurs, it feels like disruption, even though it is simply the continuation of a process that was always present. This misunderstanding leads to a fragmented way of seeing the world. Events are experienced in isolation, without recognizing how they emerge from what came before and lead into what follows. Without this sense of continuity, each change appears sudden and disconnected, creating the impression of randomness. Heraclitus challenges this by insisting that change is not a series of separate events, but a continuous flow where everything is connected. What appears as an ending is also a beginning. What appears as destruction is also transformation. The same process that brings something into existence also carries it toward its alteration. This perspective becomes clearer when considering how opposites interact over time. Something that grows must eventually decline. Something that is strong may weaken. Something that is absent may appear. These are not separate events, but different stages of the same movement. Each contains the seed of the other, not as a possibility that might occur, but as a necessity that will unfold. This creates a sense of inevitability within change, not in a rigid or mechanical way, but as a pattern that can be recognized. When one understands this pattern, events no longer appear as isolated surprises, but as expressions of a deeper continuity. At the same time, Heraclitus emphasizes that this pattern is not always obvious. It is not laid out clearly for immediate perception. It requires attention to see how things relate across time, how opposites transform into one another, and how stability itself is only a temporary balance within movement. This brings the focus back to the logos, not only as a principle that governs the world, but as something that can be understood by the human mind. The logos is common, available to all, but not all recognize it. Many live as though their own perspective is sufficient, relying only on immediate impressions rather than seeking the deeper structure behind them. To align with the logos is to move beyond this limited perspective. It is to recognize that personal interpretation is not always reliable, that what appears obvious may be incomplete, and that understanding requires looking beyond the surface. This does not mean rejecting experience, but examining it more carefully. As this alignment develops, the way one perceives change begins to shift. Instead of reacting to each moment as something separate, there's a growing awareness of continuity. The present is seen not as an isolated point, but as part of an ongoing flow that connects past and future. This awareness reduces the sense of sudden disruption. When change is expected, it is less shocking. When it is understood as part of a pattern, it becomes more intelligible. This does not eliminate difficulty, but it changes the way difficulty is experienced. There is also a shift in how stability is understood. Stability is no longer seen as the absence of change, but as a balance within it. Just as a flame maintains its form while constantly consuming fuel, something can appear stable while continuously changing. Its identity is not tied to unchanging substance, but to the pattern that persists through change. This idea extends to human life as well. A person's identity is not fixed in a single moment. It is shaped over time, through a continuous process of becoming. What remains consistent is not a static state, but a pattern of development, a direction that can be recognized even as specific details change. Understanding this removes the pressure to hold onto a fixed version of oneself or the world. It allows for adaptation without the feeling of loss that comes from expecting permanence. Change becomes less of a threat and more of a condition to be navigated. At the same time, this perspective does not lead to passivity. Recognizing the flow of events does not mean doing nothing. It means acting with an awareness of how actions fit within that flow. Instead of trying to stop change, one works with it, understanding when to act, when to adjust, and when to allow processes to unfold. This creates a different kind of engagement with the world. It is not driven by the need to control everything, but by the ability to respond appropriately within changing conditions. It requires sensitivity to timing, to context, and to the relationships between events. Heraclitus often suggests that this kind of understanding is rare, not because it is hidden, but because it requires a shift in how people think. It involves letting go of the assumption that things should remain the same and accepting that change is fundamental. This shift can be uncomfortable because it removes familiar points of certainty. Yet, within this discomfort, a deeper form of clarity begins to emerge. The world appears less stable on the surface, but more coherent underneath. Instead of seeking fixed answers, one begins to see patterns. Instead of expecting permanence, one begins to understand transformation. This transformation of perspective is gradual. It does not happen all at once, but develops through continued observation and reflection. Each time one recognizes a pattern within change, the understanding becomes stronger. Each time one sees how opposites relate, the sense of coherence increases. Over time, this leads to a more unified way of seeing the world. The divisions between events begin to fade, replaced by an awareness of connection. The tension between opposites becomes less confusing and more meaningful. The constant movement of things becomes not a source of instability, but the very structure through which reality exists. In this way, Heraclitus moves from the simple observation that everything changes to a deeper insight that change itself has an order, and that understanding this order transforms the way one experiences both the world and one's place within it. As this awareness of pattern and continuity deepens, the focus begins to shift toward the tension that exists at the heart of all things. Because for Heraclitus, it is not enough to say that everything changes or that there is an order within change. One must also understand that this order is sustained through opposition, through a constant balancing of forces that do not simply coexist, but actively define and transform one another. What appears at first as contradiction begins to reveal itself as structure. Opposites are not errors in the system, nor are they temporary disruptions that must be resolved into sameness. They are necessary, inseparable, and continuous. Without them, there would be no differentiation, no movement, and no reality as is experienced. This becomes clearer when considering that any condition carries within it the presence of its opposite, not as something separate, but as something implied. Health has meaning only in relation to illness. Rest is understood through contrast with effort. Even something as simple as a path upward is defined in relation to a path downward. These are not independent realities, but different expressions of the same underlying relationship. Heraclitus pushes this idea further by suggesting that these opposites are not fixed in place. They transform into one another. What is warm can become cold. What is alive will eventually die. What is gathered will disperse. This movement is not accidental. It is the natural unfolding of the tension that exists between opposing states. This tension is often described in terms that suggest conflict, but it is not conflict in the sense of destruction alone. It is a productive tension, similar to the way a bow must be drawn in opposite directions to function, or a musical string must be stretched to produce sound. Without this tension, there would be no activity, no expression, and no life. From this perspective, harmony takes on a different meaning. It is not the absence of tension, but the balance of it. A system is not harmonious because all differences are removed, but because opposing forces are held in a relationship that allows them to function together. This harmony is not always visible on the surface. It often appears as disorder to those who do not recognize the pattern behind it. This idea challenges the natural tendency to prefer one side of an opposition while rejecting the other. People tend to seek pleasure and avoid discomfort, to desire stability and resist change, to favor gain and reject loss. But in doing so, they misunderstand the structure of reality, because these opposites cannot be separated. To remove one would be to remove the condition that gives meaning to the other. Understanding this does not mean embracing difficulty in a simplistic way, but recognizing that it cannot be entirely removed from life. Struggle, tension, and transformation are not interruptions of a stable state. They are part of the process that makes stability possible in the first place. This realization changes the way one responds to opposition in life. Instead of seeing it as something purely negative, it begins to be understood as part of a larger pattern. Difficulty becomes something that participates in development. Loss becomes part of transition. Even conflict can be seen as a force that, when properly understood, contributes to movement and change. At the same time, this perspective does not remove the need for judgment. Not all expressions of tension are equally beneficial, and not all outcomes are the same. But it introduces a deeper layer of understanding, where events are not evaluated in isolation, but in relation to the processes they are part of. Heraclitus also suggests that this structure applies not only to the external world, but to the inner life of the individual. The mind itself experiences opposition between different thoughts, desires, and interpretations. These internal tensions are often experienced as confusion or conflict, but they can also be understood as part of the process through which clarity emerges. Just as external opposites define and transform one another, internal opposites can lead to a deeper understanding when they are examined rather than avoided. A person who reflects on conflicting thoughts can begin to see the underlying assumptions that produce them, and through this process, move toward a more coherent perspective. This makes inner conflict not simply something to eliminate, but something to engage with carefully. It becomes a source of insight rather than only a source of disturbance. When approached with attention, it reveals patterns that might otherwise remain hidden. As this understanding develops, the individual begins to see both the outer world and the inner world as expressions of the same fundamental structure. Change, opposition, and tension are present at every level, not as flaws, but as essential features of reality. This creates a shift in how one relates to both stability and instability. Stability is no longer expected to be permanent, and instability is no longer experienced as purely negative. Both are seen as phases within a continuous process, each playing a role in the unfolding of the whole. There is also a growing sense that what appears simple on the surface often conceals a deeper complexity. Events that seem straightforward may be part of larger patterns that are not immediately visible. Understanding requires patience, a willingness to look beyond first impressions, and an openness to seeing connections that are not obvious. Heraclitus often suggests that many people fail to see these connections because they rely too heavily on what is immediately apparent. They trust their senses without questioning them, and they form conclusions without considering the deeper structure behind appearances. This leads to a fragmented understanding of the world. To move beyond this fragmentation, one must learn to look beneath the surface, to recognize that what appears as separate may be connected, and that what appears as conflict may be part of a larger harmony. This does not simplify the world, but it makes it more coherent. Over time, this way of seeing begins to reshape the entire experience of reality. The constant movement of things is no longer a source of confusion, but a field of patterns. Opposites are no longer obstacles to be eliminated, but relationships to be understood. Tension is no longer something to fear, but something that gives structure to existence. In this way, Heraclitus moves closer to a complete vision, where the world is understood not as a collection of stable objects, but as an interconnected process of becoming, where every element exists in relation to others, and where the apparent contradictions of life are revealed as necessary components of a deeper and more unified order. As this vision reaches its fullest depth, Everything begins to gather into a single understanding where change, opposition, and order are no longer separate ideas, but expressions of the same underlying reality. What once appeared fragmented now reveals itself as continuous, where every moment is part of an unfolding process that does not stand still, yet never loses its coherence. The world, in this final view, is not made of fixed things that occasionally change. It is made of change itself. Stability is not the foundation of reality, but a temporary appearance that emerges when opposing forces reach a certain balance. Beneath that appearance, movement continues without interruption, carrying everything forward. This realization reshapes the way existence is understood. Instead of searching for something permanent to hold on to, the mind begins to recognize that permanence, in a usual sense, does not exist. What exists is continuity, a flow that never stops, where forms arise, transform, and pass, while the underlying order remains. This order, the logos, is not something distant or abstract. It is present in every transformation, in every interaction between opposites, in every moment of becoming. It does not remove change, but gives it structure. It is what makes the world intelligible even as it constantly shifts. To understand, this is not simply to observe from a distance, but to see oneself as part of it. The individual is not outside the flow, trying to control or resist it. They are within it, shaped by it, and capable of recognizing its patterns. This recognition creates a different kind of awareness, one that does not cling to fixed points, but moves with the rhythm of change itself. At this stage, resistance begins to lose its force. The impulse to hold things in place, to demand that they remain as they are, becomes less convincing because it is seen as an attempt to oppose the very structure of reality. What once felt like stability is now understood as temporary, and what once felt like disruption is recognized as continuation. This does not lead to passivity or detachment in a simple sense. It leads to a form of alignment. Instead of acting against the flow, the individual begins to act within it, understanding that every action is part of a larger process. This creates a sense of timing and proportion, where actions are not forced, but arise in response to the conditions that are present. There's also a deeper acceptance of transformation, not as something that must be endured, but as something that defines existence itself. Growth, decay, creation, and destruction are no longer seen as separate phases, but as interconnected aspects of the same movement. Each gives rise to the next, forming a continuous cycle that does not come to a final rest. Within this cycle, even what appears as an end is understood differently. An ending is not a complete disappearance, but a transition into another form. The same process that brings something into being also carries it into change, and through that change, into something else. Nothing stands outside this movement. This perspective brings a certain clarity to the experience of life. Instead of being caught between the desire for permanence and the reality of change, the individual begins to see that these are not opposing truths, but different ways of looking at the same process. The desire for permanence arises from a limited view, while the recognition of change reveals a deeper structure. As this clarity develops, the sense of fragmentation begins to dissolve. Events no longer appear as isolated or disconnected. Each moment is seen as part of a larger continuity, where what happens now is linked to what has happened before and what will follow. This creates a sense of coherence that does not depend on stillness. At the same time, this coherence does not simplify the world into something predictable. Change remains complex, and the future remains open. But the presence of an underlying order provides a way of navigating this complexity without becoming lost in it. There is also a transformation in how one relates to opposites. Instead of choosing one side and rejecting the other, the mind begins to see both as necessary. Light and dark, gain and loss, presence and absence are no longer treated as absolute opposites that must be separated, but as conditions that define each other within a larger unity. This understanding creates a form of balance that is not rigid. It is dynamic, capable of adjusting as conditions change, while remaining grounded in the recognition of the underlying pattern. It allows the individual to move through different situations without needing them to remain the same. Over time, this way of seeing becomes less of a philosophical position and more of a natural orientation. The mind no longer has to remind itself that everything changes. It begins to experience reality in that way directly. The flow of events, the transformation of conditions, and the interplay of opposites become familiar rather than disruptive. In this state, there is a kind of quiet clarity. It does not eliminate difficulty, but it removes the confusion that comes from misunderstanding the nature of reality. Change is no longer something that must be explained away or resisted. It is simply how things are. What remains constant is not any particular form, but the pattern of transformation itself. This pattern, though never standing still, provides the only kind of stability that exists, not as fixed permanence, but as continuous order within movement. In the end, Heraclitus presents a vision where the world is alive with motion, where every moment is part of an ongoing process, and where understanding comes not from holding on to what passes, but from recognizing the structure that persists through all change. It is a way of seeing that replaces the search for stillness with an awareness of flow, and in doing so, reveals a deeper and more enduring coherence within the ever-changing nature of existence.